Okay, good. I still have more questions, but I want to open it up and let's see what other people have to ask.
Yeah, I do have. I'm still curious about the first female pharaoh or king in Egypt called Hatshepsut. Just wondering, because when I visit Egypt and in 2005 and I stand in the temple for Hatshepsut, and the local guy that mentioned about they tried to erase some records yeah, from the temple, and I'm still don't know why, and I'm curious about this pharaoh or king in Egypt. What do you think about Hatshepsut?
Thank you. It's one of my favorite subjects, actually. Now, she was at the early part of the 18th dynasty, and there was a shortage of boy babies. Now, we have to understand that dynastic Egypt is patriarchal, but there were certain times when the matriarchal energy came back, and during Hatshepsut's time was one of them. So Tutmosis the first was her father, Tutmosis the second was her brother, and Tutmosis the third was her husband. And there was no one to take the throne. So she was a queen in her own right, and then she became pharaoh, and she kind of dressed up as a man and wore the false beard and all of that. And apparently her brother, 20 years after she died, they took all the statues, they broke them, and they put them into one pit at the temple of Queen Hatshepsut. But they've only been restoring that recently. And so from 2005 to 2013, you'll see a really, really big difference in terms of what's going on at the Temple of Queen Hatshepsut. And I used to go there and say, along this whole wall, down this whole area, used to be a university and a training ground. And I would describe what was there, and it was all underground. You couldn't see anything. It was sand. And again, this was coming from my memories. And in the last couple of years going there, they've excavated it, and it's exactly how I'd seen it in my visions. Now, one of the things about Hatshepsut is she talks about being starseed and being half divine. And so she says that her father was taken over by a star being, impregnated her mother, and so she's half starseed. And the story, when you stand in front of the temple and look to the left, there's a whole wall inside one of these chambers that's open to the front that has the story of this divine birth. And it's been largely destroyed. It's really hard to see what's there. But we know that's what the story is. And so there seems to have been a shortage of boy babies. And Maurice Cotterell talks about changes in fertility based on sun cycles. And I think we're facing some of that now, where there are, there's men don't have as much hair on their body. There's changes in fertility rates among most of us these days. And so the statistics are showing that there are ebbs and flows in fertility based on sun cycles. And so if you move down the dynasty, down to the Amarna period with Nefertiti and Akhenaten, you'll see that they had 6 daughters, and the boy babies were dying, which is why King Tut ended up taking the throne at the age of 8. But there was all kinds of corruption going on at the time. But I think the Amarna period and Queen Hatshepsut were a time when the old spirituality was percolating back up. Very interesting time. And she did a lot of good. Now, had she not been female, she would have been recognized as the most prolific, fair, and progressive pharaoh ever. But when they found out that she was female, in the typical traditional patriarchal way, they smashed her. Now, recently at the Metropolitan Museum, these 28 statues were brought together for the first time. It was in 2009 in March in New York, and I happened to be there on the way to Egypt and on the way back. And I stood alone inside this hall with all these statues that they found all the pieces. Like, they broke them all, but they were all in one pit, so they were able to painstakingly put them back together. And just an indication of the corruption, those statues never went back to Egypt. They closed whole rooms in the National Museum in order to say that the museum is being absolutely ransacked. There's less than half of what was in there the first time I was there. And so there's really a lot of artifacts are disappearing, but it's too late. You know, we've seen them. So it's almost like locking the barn after the horse has been stolen. But it's one of the most important times in Egypt that we have record of. So thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
I have one. You said earlier that at the base of the pyramids, the foundation stones go back a lot further than the pyramids themselves. So, are you? I'm kind of questioning that, like from a biblical sense, because you know in the Bible, the Jews are supposed to have helped build the pyramids. It seems kind of a discrepancy there.
Does the Bible really say the Jews helped build the pyramid? I missed that memo. I don't think so. Does it say that?
Yeah, that's what the Jews were doing there. They were slaves helping build the pyramids.
Well, none of that adds up, because Moses, they try to say, was contemporary with Hatshepsut, was contemporary with Akhenaten. The thing is that if people don't understand that the Bible wants us to think we're 6,000 years old, right?
Right.
And so most of the problems that people have understanding Egypt is that they don't know how to divide it up into larger cycles of time. Because how do you think about 50,000 years ago if your brain and school has said 6,000 years? And so the pyramids could not have been built by slaves. All of this stuff of dragging the stones along and like it would have taken 20 years if you placed one stone every minute 24/7. Well, that's logistically impossible. You have to feed the people. There weren't enough people. But it was built by incredibly powerful engineers. I mean, you have the technology in it. As I said, we could not possibly put those pyramids up, even a small one. The Japanese tried. The idea of moving those stones down the river and all of that, and it's impossible. Like there's one stone on the Giza Plateau that weighs 200 tons. Ton is 2,000 pounds. Now, a rail car for your LRT, or what do you call it, MRT, whatever it is up there, your fast rapid transit, one car weighs 9,000 pounds. So let's imagine us getting one of those cars on the roof of the building you're in right now every minute. Just us lifting it up. Well, how are you going to get it up there? And after you put 10 cars up there, where are you going to put the rest of them? It's logistically incorrect. So this idea of being built by slaves, and the Egyptians were obsessed with death and they were worshiping animals, none of that's the way it went at all. And that's what the Pyramid Code is doing. It's debunking these myths. So when I say that there's a larger platform from when the pyramids were there, I'm talking 50,000 years ago. I'm talking a unified ground plan from a long, long time ago, more than one processional cycle. And Hakim used to say this, and he's the indigenous wisdom keeper who's featured in the Pyramid Code, who's passed on. And the point of doing the Pyramid Code was actually for his legacy, because he understood a lot of things, but he didn't care about proving it. He just knew it. And so I took it upon myself to find scientists that would corroborate parts of what he said and get animators to build things that he was talking about, to then put the voiceover in and put the whole thing together, which is what the Pyramid Code is. And so the degree to which someone is tied to academia is the short fuse that they're on about how far they'll allow themselves to say the date is wrong. So Robert Schoch, he did some studies on climatology with John Anthony West on the dating of the Sphinx, because the Sphinx is weather eroded, water eroded. And the climatology says that it had to be way back when there would be enough rain on the Giza Plateau, because now it's a desert. Which is why I'm saying climatology has to speak to linguistics, has to speak to archaeology. Everything has to speak to everything for us to put this story back together. And so it just doesn't add up the way they've been trying to tell us. And they have no evidence that the pyramids were tombs. And so they put these things together and they keep teaching it in school, and we're supposed to just buy it, and that's supposed to confuse us and think it was slaves. There's no way that those stones were rolled on rollers with trees. Where's the trees? There's no way that you could have fed the people and been able to do it that way, or spend 20 years putting a stone up every minute, day and night, in the night. It just doesn't add up. Now, they did find something called the pyramid, so-called pyramid builders dig. And I had a place called the Hall of Records Retreat Center, which is right adjacent to that dig, which is south of the third pyramid. And they found skeletons of people and beer making and bread making equipment and damage to people's spines and that sort of thing. But it's not that old. And so anybody can say anything if you're not looking deeply and really going underneath and really trying to understand what happened. And carbon-14 dating is notoriously making things look younger. And so I think that there's been a real agenda to make us think that. And why, just like Ethan was saying a minute ago, why do we think the Russians are, why are people covering things up? What's the conspiracy? And I think it's so that we don't find out that we're actually divine beings, that we can be empowered, that God's within us. Like all of this divide and conquer and pit one group against the other and war and all of that, that's all patriarchal nonsense. And it has nothing to do with who we really are and what the ancients knew we were. And that's what's at stake. That's why it's important for us to understand this stuff.
Okay, good. Other questions?
You've probably heard of the popular story that Carter went into, I guess, into the pyramid with Tutankhamun, and then afterwards a terrible curse took over. What are your thoughts on that? Was that just made up to scare people away, or?
Well, there's a lot of things there. First of all, if you spend enough time in the Valley of the Kings, which I have, and you see his house, Howard Carter's house, you'll hear that the people in the area already knew about that tomb. And the people that were funding Carter, there was this whole espionage thing. And then when they actually got inside the tomb, they took a lot of stuff out before they took the pictures. And he ended up being really wealthy. But they also talk about spores and things that were, the curse would have been something where there was some kind of not virus, but mold in the mummy tissue, in the bandaging, that they could have inhaled that would have made them sick. So it wasn't so much a curse as it was the actual physicality of the years, the thousands of years that would have been in there. But there's a lot they haven't told us. You don't usually hear that his body was covered in blue lotus petals and that sort of thing. And so again, who's paying for what? Follow the money. What's the political agenda, and who got rich doing it, and what story do they tell that we have no way of verifying? So again, this Amarna period and the Queen Hatshepsut is very interesting to me. I feel like I'm connected to those two periods of time as well as the one that was 50,000 years ago. And that's the trail that I'm following. And like I say, I don't think you can prove a hypothesis without going into physical evidence, but I do think you can get a hypothesis, like a hunch, from a cellular memory. And so there's a lot of distortion, and mostly my gut is what goes yes, no, on those things. But I certainly have read all these books, everything that I can find over and over again, to try to find the kernels of truth that are laced within them. And I've been at this for 50 years, so.
Other questions?
So you mentioned that you had, or you have this belief that many of the sites are much older than the Egyptians. So do you think that the Egyptians themselves came across these kinds of sites and then just built on top of them?
Yes. And Nabta and Amarna are the only two that have nothing under, well, Nabta does have something underneath. Amarna had nothing underneath because Nefertiti and Akhenaten, they were mad at the Amun priesthood. They were full of corruption. It's very similar to the Catholic Church, and we still say Amen, which I refuse to say, because it's their lineage, and they were doing a lot of damage. And Nefertiti and Akhenaten said, goodbye, we're starting over again. We're going to this site. And slowly they infiltrated and poisoned one of their daughters, and that's where King Tut was raised. And then he died in a hurry, and then of course Dr. Zaki Hawass, who was in charge of the Department of Antiquities, he basically said, oh no, he didn't, he had a clubbed foot and a cleft palate and a disease, and he died of malaria. Well, what is all this propaganda and trying to prove that he was Akhenaten's son, which also can't add up? He was part of that royal family, but I don't believe that's true for 1 second. And I've got my reasons for that. And they spent 12 years trying to prove that, and they fudged the data. And so, you know, there's just a lot of discrepancies there, for sure.
Okay, you had another question?
Yeah, similar question. Just because I'm curious about, still curious about Amana. Why Akhenaten want to move from somewhere to Amana? Is that kind of? Well, I'm curious about the force. Is it all about disease or something else?
I'm sorry, I know you asked about Akhenaten and Amarna, but I had trouble understanding your words and I can't see you. So could you repeat that question? Hi.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just curious about what kind of force to force Akhenaten move to Amana? Is that
What kind of force had him move?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
all about disease or something else. Or,
Disease? No.
no.
Okay, let's just look at, I mentioned Tutmosis 1, 2, 3. Let's talk about Amenhotep 2, 3, 4. So Amenhotep II was Akhenaten's grandfather, and there's a temple called Kalebsha, which is right close to the Aswan Dam that most people don't go to. And it was moved, like when the Aswan Dam was built, it was interestingly Russian scientists, and it was a disaster in terms of the ecology. And 18 major temples were drowned in Lake Nasser, which is the biggest man-made lake on the planet. And Kalabsha was one of them. And it took the UN years and years and years to pull those temples out. And so recently, I started going to Kalabsha, and what you see is the story of the youth, and you always know a youth because they've got one ponytail, they've got a shaved head and a ponytail coming out of the side of their head, or you'll see the thumb pointing to the mouth. And so it started with this whole idea. It was a multi-generational change where the new spirituality was coming through. So just like we've got such an ecological disaster on our planet now, we're probably not going to fix it, but maybe our children's children will fix it. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's not something that, you know, you don't have a whole worldwide change quickly. And so I think that the seeds were planted by Akhenaten's grandfather, Amenhotep II, and Amenhotep III would be the child that was shown. But they have all these spiritual things, and you can see how they were talking about. The temple walls are absolutely filled from floor to ceiling of a storyline that makes a lot of sense to me now that I've deciphered a lot of the different symbols. So then Amenhotep III would have been the one that built the 180 Sekhmet statues and the Luxor temple and the things that Ramses came along and said was him. And so the sacred geometry that Chris Dunn talks about in the faces that are absolutely balanced and all of that. Well, then Akhenaten was Amenhotep IV. And he changed his name because Amen, he turned it to Aten. And so it was Tutankhaten, but he had been born Tutankhaten, and then they changed it back to Tutankhamen. Okay, the Amun priesthood was corrupt. They wanted half of everybody's grain to ensure the person's salvation at death. Well, the Egyptians understood there was no death. You drop your body, but the Ba, which is your spiritual being that lives on between incarnations, continued. And so the Amun priesthood was like the Catholic Church. No. You have to pay us half your harvest, and we will ensure your passage to the other side. But the real spirituality understood that each person has that within themselves. And that's what Hakim really understood too. Like what happens when you pass. Because the Egyptians had no word for death. So this business of the Amun priesthood being more and more corrupt, collecting money from every single person to feed themselves, to make themselves rich, was not true spirituality. It was religion, which is what we have now. You know, my God's better than your God is what's causing a lot of these fights between people, which are stimulated artificially and all that. So, when Nefertiti and Akhenaten said we're starting over and they closed the temples, they moved to a place in the middle between the two capitals that used to switch between Heliopolis and Thebes, each Sothic cycle, each time Sirius did one of its major cycles, they would switch the capital. And he knew that that would cause civil war. So they picked a place in the middle, which was Akhetaten. And they started a new civilization there. And it was really pure, and people were equal, and there was creativity and art, and it was fantastically beautiful and totally healthy. But the Ammon priesthood was still outside on the back burner, kind of angry, and wanted to take it back because they wanted the money from the people. He was crazy, and he was deformed, and he didn't know what he was doing, and he went to the one God, and they didn't change the gods. You still see Hathor and Isis and all these different gods and goddesses represented. But they're criticizing him, saying he went to one God, but then the Catholics went to one God. But he's bad for doing it. So it's all distorted. It had nothing to do with disease. But when they started to slowly poison one of their daughters, and I don't know if any of you saw Anna and the King. You know that movie?
Yeah.
Okay. So the king had 99 children and many, many concubines, and Monkey was the little girl that died. And he was inconsolable after. He just wouldn't come out, and everybody was trying to get him, even though he had 98 more children. This is what happened to Akhenaten. When he realized that the Amun priesthood was coming, and they would kill his child, he became very demoralized. And they slowly infiltrated, and then they flattened the place. And when I went there, Carrie Cassidy was actually with me on one of the times I went there, and she said it looks like a nuclear bomb hit it. And then so Tutankhaten was trained to understand this, and he was kind of had a foot in each camp. And he understood that if he did become pharaoh at the ripe age of 8, that he would have to make them think that he was of the Amun. And the minute that they found out he was actually of the Aten, they killed him. But then they had a warehouse sort of thing, a cache of places where they kept mummies, and they just emptied that out and filled it up like a warehouse of stuff from Amarna and said it was King Tut's stuff. But he was buried in a hurry, and the stuff wasn't his. So when I first saw the King Tut exhibit that is on location at the National Museum in Egypt, I went looking around and went, this isn't his stuff. This was somebody else's stuff. And the traveling exhibit of the King Tut is a replica. And so most people, when they go to the traveling exhibit that's been in many, many cities, they're not sure what they feel. Well, that's because it's not the real stuff. You understand? So, and that's when people go to Egypt too, and they hear not the real story, they end up confused. And so there's been a huge curiosity about what's going on in Egypt, but people haven't really gotten access to the real story.
Okay, other questions?
I have a...
Go ahead.
I may have missed this at the beginning, you may have said, but who were you in the past life? Who exactly were you?
Oh, I'm not going to tell you that.
Oh.
Okay.
Well, there's no proof. There's no proof, and I would never say that. And the other thing too is, I don't know if you've seen, it's funny I keep on making references to movies, but in Bull Durham with, Kevin Costner, and he's talking to the girl, and he says, how come with past lives like everybody's Napoleon or somebody? And I think we need to understand how we get birthed into pop. Okay, I just wrote out the answer to that question.
Yeah, we only have a couple more minutes, so you go ahead and answer that question, and then I think we maybe have one more, and then we'll have to call it a night.
Okay, so I wrote out the answer, but I'll say it.
Okay, go ahead.
So what I was saying is that my understanding of twin flames and soulmates is that we are birthed in pods of 8 to 12 souls that keep dividing in two, and those divide in two, and it goes down the line. And everyone in the lineage of that division is our soulmate. And in the last division, as I said, are our twin flames. So in Bull Durham, they say Napoleon is in our lineage. It doesn't mean we were him, but it means we're familiar with his energy. So for me, in my cellular memory, I resonate with 3 distinct periods of time in ancient Egypt. So one is 50,000 years ago, before the pyramids, when the unified ground plan was in place. So the places where the 3 pyramids were corresponded to the stars of Orion. But that doesn't mean the pyramids were there yet. The second one is in the High Court of Queen Hatshepsut, and the third one is Adamarna. And that's why it matters to me so much when they trash Akhenaten, because I think he was incredibly special. But I also think he was starseed. And Nefertiti and Akhenaten had the distended skulls, and I understand from Ethan that you had Brian Forstner in your little group recently. And he's looking at the distended skulls from Peru, and of course they were distended skulls. They say it's stylistic in the High Court of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, but I say no. And then we see the skull of Tut, and there's many distended skulls that we see. And so that was some kind of a genetic anomaly, which I think is highly important. And I also know that there's a connection between Peru and Egypt, because the mummy tissue that every single mummy that they've tested, the tissue has got cocaine, or the cocoa leaves, that only come from Peru. And you see the style of the reed boats that you see at Lake Titicaca still in Bolivia and Peru is exactly the same as the boats they had in Egypt, the shape of them. And so there's a lot of connection there, which speaks to the idea that the water-soaked boats that you see in the museum, boat museum right beside the Great Pyramid, is water-stained. So they say that it was a symbolic boat to take the king to heaven. Well, okay, maybe it's a symbol, but why is it water-stained if it wasn't on the water?
Okay, one last question.
This question has to do with your perception of your past lives. When you, I'm assuming that when you were planning on going there, did you have any sort of like physical sensation that let you know first, or was it just after you got there that you received the memories of it? Like what was your purpose or desire to like go to these places?
Well, I won't call it desire as much as necessity or something that was inevitable. I have been living with this my whole life. I don't, like for me, I was chasing after something that I couldn't let go of because I had to understand, and then I would read all this stuff and just get crushed inside because I knew it wasn't right. And I spent a lot of time thinking, who's talking to me here? Why is this important? Why do I even care? But I was driven, absolutely driven. So, away, reading the stuff, I would resonate with certain things, and then I would get to Egypt and I would get other messages, and it took me a long, long time to put it together, and Hakeem helped somewhat, but he insisted that I already knew stuff before you tell me anything, I had to already know. So it's been a long journey of a gut reaction, loads of research, and really just trying to be as clear as I can and getting more conscious so that I could figure it out. And so it's definitely been a lifelong quest, no question about that.
Okay, I think we'll have to end there, Carmen. I have at least 3 more questions. I think the other people do too, but we have to be out of this space in approximately 1 minute. So I want to say thank you, and I'll be talking to you soon. And you're going to Göbekli Tepe is your next trip?
Well, I'm going to put a whole trip together with Turkey, the Bosnian pyramids, Russia, and Egypt.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, we could easily talk for another hour, but you should go have breakfast or something, and we have to go. So thank you, Carmen.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
And I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Have a good day.
Bye.